At issue this week, a major shift in Canada's position on the Israel-Hamas war.
Stroke L27 has been adopted.
The UN passed a non-binding resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. Canada voted in favour.
In the face of an unfolding humanitarian catastrophe, we continue to call for a return to humanitarian pauses. We're going to keep participating in urgent international efforts towards a sustainable ceasefire.
But that vote is causing tensions inside the Liberal caucus.
I was very disappointed in the vote at the United Nations.
Is the UN resolution a sign of shifting support for Israel, and will it affect unity in the Liberal caucus? Hey everyone, I'm Rosemary Barton, here to break it all down in person. Chantal Hebert, Coyne and Althia Raj. Good to see you all in person. Clearly this was a shift for the government, and I will say that there was a difference for people inside the caucus, Jewish MPs inside the caucus, between the statement the government made with Australia, New Zealand and us versus the vote in the UN, because they found those to be obviously not complementary policy moves. What did you make of that?
And the statement the foreign minister put out on Twitter afterwards,
yes,
in which they listed all the things that should be listed of Hamas should lay down its arms, Hamas should release the hostages. Hamas is both the cause of this and could end it if it chose to do so today. So to put it all on Israel is this resolution which was not brought in good faith by people who were trying to mediate it, but was brought by a bunch of countries that have always been hostile to Israel. For Canada to sign on to this, I mean, abstaining from it is one thing, which has been our historic norm, but to suddenly and unannounced sign on to this thing, I think is a terrible betrayal. I will say, to compound matters, at the same time as the Liberals were doing this on Israel, we had the Conservatives looking like they're going wobbly on Ukraine. This was not a good week for Canada as a constructive international player.
And yeah, Chantal.
I have a bit of a different take. There were tensions within caucus,
yes,
before that. I believe that if Canada had voted for a resolution like this 3 weeks ago, there would have been resignations from the Liberal caucus. People would have left over it. That didn't happen. I'm not convinced that it's going to happen. And I thought there was a bit of a 1-2 punch here, that New Zealand, Australia, Canada, that statement was really meant to signal that they were going to vote the way they voted in the General Assembly at the UN. But only 9 countries supported Israel. Only one of those was the US, the only G7 country that actually supported Israel in the General Assembly. Now, normally I would have expected the President of the United States to reiterate his support for Israel. That is not what happened. The sequence was this vote took place with these countries, including Canada, voting the way they did, and Joe Biden came out and said the current government of Israel is losing international support. It was as if the allies of the US were providing an illustration for how much support Israel is losing internationally. And I do believe that the fact no one has resigned from caucus when they would have 3 weeks ago or a month ago is also a sign that what has been happening in Gaza is making it harder to support the way that the Israel government is conducting that battle. Yeah. On Ukraine, I totally agree with Andrew. It was a weird spectacle.
The resignations piece, it definitely was on the table, I think, for some people, according to what I heard, Althia. I don't know that it still is, but I wonder if this is also because there were a lot of people in caucus who were decrying what was happening in Gaza for many weeks and not getting the attention, perhaps, that they wanted from their own party.
I hope there's not any resignation in caucus, because I hope that there is a space for people to disagree and still remain united. I think it would be really sad, just personally speaking, to have MPs decide that because on this issue they can't stay. Because what we're seeing is outside on the streets, people seem to be getting more and more entrenched in their positions. Yeah. The reason the government changed its vote, I believe, is because last time the same vote happened at the UN, they tried to bring forward an amendment, and the amendments need 2/3 in order to pass. And it got the majority, but it didn't get 2/3 to add a condemnation of Hamas in the motion. And this happened again this week. And I think they knew that that was going to happen, and that's why, to Chantal's point, Israel, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada came out in order to kind of add an asterisk to their vote. But how their vote played out several weeks ago was that it seemed like Canada was in favor of allowing the killing of innocent women and children, and they didn't want that to happen. And I think those arguments started to get more and more credence. And I think the other thing that happened is that Israel made it difficult for Canada to side with Israel. When you have the ambassador of Israel to the UK come out on TV and say, we do not believe in a two-state solution, there should not be a Palestinian state living next to Israel, that makes it hard for Canada that has a two-state solution to say that, you know, we abide by that. And it gives credence to people who do believe that this is a genocide, that Israel wants to wipe Gaza off the map. And so I think that is the reason why the government changed it.
But does it mean that Canada cannot help engage with Israel now because it's taken?
Well, yeah.
But we're not the major player there.
No.
The major player is the U.S.
Yeah.
And what the U.S. needs is pressure that it can bring on the current government of Israel. Let's be serious. There were massive demonstrations in Israel against the Netanyahu government over the past few weeks. So when I watched the Canadian position and the American position, my take isn't that they fell apart, they're apart from each other. It's that they are all putting pressure
but they're moving in the
to try to get a regime change in Jerusalem.
And I think we can separate the current government of Israel and its stance on things like the two-state solution from the prosecution of the war against Hamas, on which there can also be reasonable differences of opinion of exactly how it's being prosecuted. But the principle that Israel is not only entitled to, but obliged to defend its citizens from this monstrous threat on its border, and that doing so requires taking Hamas out of commission, and that in doing so, and in prosecuting a war, inevitably there will be civilian casualties. People seem to be trying to say that Israel, alone amongst countries on earth, has only the right to defend itself if it doesn't cause any casualties.
I don't think that's what they're saying.
I think that's just remarkably one-sided.
I think that is the way that some will frame it. But others will say that getting rid of Hamas is a worthy goal that Canada supports, but it's also consideration has to be given in how you do that.
Yeah, I agree with
If you
that.
told everybody to go to the south and you start bombing in the south and there is no place, no safe place for people to live, where there is going to be famine and there could be cholera, you know, I think it's normal for...
Name me another country in the prosecution of a war that tells people where it's going to be dropping bombs. This is unique.
But if there's nowhere to go...
them in any event. I mean, what Joe Biden had to say about the way the war is conducted is literally the Canadian position. Yeah. The only difference is the vote in the UN, but bottom line, in substance, Canada and the US are saying the same thing. The way the war is being conducted is exacting too many civilian casualties that cannot be
Israel should be held to the
rationalized.
standards of international law. Everyone reasonably should agree with that. I don't agree they should be held to a different standard unique to Israel, which is what seems to be happening.
The UNGA motion actually just says that. So it doesn't matter because it's just a symbol. It is non-binding. It will mean nothing.
It is certainly not going to change Israel.
What is interesting is all the caveats also that the Liberals went to great lengths to put, some of which are, you know, no Palestinian state with Hamas in the leadership. Yeah. Does that even mean then that there will not be a democratic vote? Because you could call Hamas something else, but will the international community be deciding who rules over a free Palestine? I mean, we were getting ahead of ourselves, but it is interesting how they have tried to couch their position, so that they can please as many people as they can please.
But if this is the world concern turning in this direction, as we all seem to agree on at least that point, and Israel is not responsive to that, I just don't know what happens in terms of global
But there
pressure.
are democratic forces in play in Israel. It's not for us to sit and say Israel, because a specific government is acting, a controversial government is acting in one way. That is not Israel in the same way that Premier Legault is not Quebec. Yeah. But have you ever seen a foreign policy issue that is so seized Canadian politics, including people on the streets.
So divided people,
It is in a league of its own.
Yeah.
Including people who have no tie to
That's right.
It would certainly be the best thing for Israel's war effort to have a different government. There cannot be a less persuasive spokesman for the Israeli cause than Benjamin Netanyahu.
Okay. We're going to leave this topic there. That was easier to do in person, that topic. That's a hard one.
Yeah.
When we return, we're going to take a look at the current state of Canada's parliament.
I don't want to insult Canadian children because, quite frankly, they behave better than most Conservative MPs.
Between partisan games and a speaker controversy, how are politicians leaving Parliament as they prepare to break for the holidays? That's next on The National. Parliament is set to break for the holidays after a chaotic sitting between Conservatives forcing votes and partisan games.
We are going to put in thousands of amendments at committee and in the House of Commons, forcing all-night, round-the-clock voting.
I think they need to, have a moment to reflect on their behavior and to think about whether this is how they really want to represent their constituents by bringing in silly partisan games.
And an ongoing controversy with the Speaker. What is the state of Parliament as MPs head back to their ridings? Okay, let's bring everybody back to break it down. Chantal, Andrew, and Althia, all with me here in person in Toronto. I think it just means that they all need to go home for a bit. Like, that's where we're at the point where we need a reset, but perhaps it tells us a bigger story about the toxicity of Parliament, attitudes in Parliament, whether anything serious can get done there. Chantal, you want to start?
Well, serious things do get done and did get done.
Yep.
So it's not as if Parliament was paralyzed and no legislation was passed.
That's right.
Or no conversations were had. Some of the more interesting conversations, the one we had on Israel, the Conservatives are taking a pass on. It's interesting to see where they go on Ukraine because their behavior has been strange. But I do think that this last bit of vote marathon is the Canadians are tuning it off.
Sure.
Christmas is coming. No one is taking it seriously. It's not as if, there's a deadline and a life and death issue that Parliament is divided over. I think the Conservatives could have spared themselves the game playing. It may bring in money.
Maybe.
To the party coffers. But beyond that, I think it goes against their efforts to show themselves as a government in waiting.
It also, from the people I spoke to, certainly energized the Liberals in a way I hadn't seen before. Maybe because they didn't get any sleep, and maybe because they were happy to see the boss for a long period of time. Like, I don't know what it was about, but it did energize them, I think, in a way that Conservatives didn't expect.
Well, and maybe that abacus poll also. Now, it's just one poll.
Yeah. Yes, very much so.
So, 5% swing, maybe that's exaggerated. But what's more interesting to me was some of the sort of the crosstabs, as they say in the business in there, some of the more probing questions they asked people. And one of the aspect of which was, when you go, as the Conservatives have gone, from 32 to 40% in such a hurry, those new arrivals are very different voters than the ones that you had at 30% that stuck with you.
They're not your hardcore supporters,
And some of the antics that you do that bring in the donations and rev up that hardcore base is going to give some of those voters a bit of pause. And I think you may have been seeing first signs of that. It took some doing. They had to do about 3 or 4 different debacles, frankly, before I think it really registered with people. But this is the kind of thing where there's a large block of voters who would like to see the back of Justin Trudeau and the Liberals, but some section of those are going to say, wait a minute, what am I getting into with the new people?
Yeah, Althia.
So the abacus poll is interesting because there's still a 10-point spread. Let's not make it sound like the Liberals are on an upswing. Woo! Although some Liberals seem to be treating it that way.
Yes, they do.
But it's the appetite for change and the people who still believe the government is on the wrong track hasn't changed. So it's people who looked at the Conservatives and said, oh, I'm not sure that you're who I thought I was. Mm-hmm. And I agree. I think Ukraine has been hugely beneficial for the Liberals. This was a vote to send the free trade deal to committee. Mm-hmm. And it's not part of the estimates. It's not a confidence vote. And the Conservatives say that they voted against it solely because it included language on pricing carbon. Now, Ukraine, we've already talked about this, has a price on carbon. So it doesn't make any sense. And I know that this was communicated to Mr. Poilievre's and his team, yet this is the decision that they made. And because the leader hasn't been perhaps as firm as some, like Andrew, would have liked him to be, there is this impression left out there that maybe he's dog whistling to a bunch of Republican people.
I'm more persuaded of that now than I was before. They brought out Michael Chong and James Bazan to make the to say we stand foursquare with Ukraine. Why didn't they bring out the leader? Well,
and these were the two that actually suggested that they should vote for the bill. But the other thing I wanted to say about the filibuster, I love filibusters. I love parliamentary procedure.
You're probably the only person in the world.
But when you do filibuster, you should show up to the filibuster. And the reason that it energized the Liberals, and to the dismay of most Conservative MPs, their leader wasn't there with them. So it wasn't...
He was there for parts. He was there for parts, to be fair to him.
Justin Trudeau was there way more than... And even most Conservative MPs were not even in the House. They were voting on their apps. So if you're going to have an exercise like that, to make a big show about you're forcing people to stay in the House, you should be there too.
But I also think, setting aside the Ukraine issue, but going to the carbon pricing, I think the Conservatives overplayed their hand. They had a win with the carve-outs that Justin Trudeau agreed to. But by being so obsessed with anything, like we want the world not to have carbon pricing, was basically their position on Ukraine. They have turned the spotlight on the absence of any serious plan to deal with climate change. And it looks like they think they're going to be able to go in an election and say, we've said no to every possible approach to a strategy on climate change, including the latest, a cap on emissions. But it doesn't matter because you are broke and it's Justin Trudeau's fault. I'm not sure that's going to work.
I'm not sure it won't. It certainly hasn't worked for them in the past, very clearly. I'm not sure whether the next election is going to be, the public's going to be in the same...
Depends where the economy is, probably.
Right? I think that same Abacus poll showed that, and I know it sounds contradictory, showed that even as conservative-minded voters were against a carbon tax, more of them wanted a serious plan to tackle climate change from the Conservatives.
Because they think they're not paying for it.
I know.
But the point is... Nobody would have known that there was anything to do with carbon pricing in the free trade deal with Ukraine if they hadn't said anything. So they should have just let it go to committee, and if they have something they want to amend from the deal, do it there. They created their own problem.
And talked more about the carve-out and hit the government over that for weeks on end. Okay, well, there you go. We have to take a short break, but when we return, we'll look at the Speaker of the House and if we're going to see a resolution to that controversy. That's next. The Speaker of the House is still in the hot seat. A parliamentary committee is calling for him to apologize and pay a fine or resign altogether. It comes in the wake of new allegations.
There is evidence of another partisan activity that the Speaker was engaged with.
The NDP are alleging Andrew Scheer of similar partisan appearances while he was in the job.
Andrew Scheer did the same kind of partisan fundraising after his election as Speaker.
So is this Speaker likely to survive this test? I don't have the answer, but let's see if our panelists do. Chantal, Andrew, and Althia. I don't know where this is going, and certainly, you know, there was a story that we published this morning about Andrew Scheer doing something he shouldn't have done in his office, and then allegations from the NDP that he played that game when he was Speaker. I don't know if we're at the point where this doesn't matter anymore, or whether they're going to go on a break and Greg Fergus will just survive. Who wants to go first?
I think either he has the confidence of the House or he doesn't. If he doesn't, I don't think it matters, frankly, what the reason is. You can talk about Andrew Scheer being a hypocrite, and I'm sure he is. You can talk about that he still has the confidence of the Liberals, but if you only have the confidence of one side of the House,
work,
I think we've seen in the past that doesn't work. I don't see how you come back from this. If once the other parties have said we don't want him to be our Speaker, we're not willing to recognize his authority, I think it's done.
But then who is acceptable, I guess, would be the question.
They have 330-something MPs. I'm sure they can find a replacement Speaker. But that being said, if you've lost the confidence of almost half the MPs in the House of Commons, the Bloc Québécois and the Conservatives, you're done. Especially in these times in a fractious House. And yes, the fact that the Liberals still have confidence in their own colleague actually makes things worse.
Yes, it does, actually. The NDP seem to have a little confidence in him, too, Althea. They'd like him to pay a fine or something.
They do for now. Yeah, well, the fine, there's precedent for the fine, as we have learned, because the Board of Internal Economy gave a fine to Andrew Scheer for $500.
But not when he was Speaker.
No. But so there is precedent for treating matters in this way. What is interesting is that usually we don't actually know what the breakdown of support for a speaker is because it's done in a streaker ballot. So maybe the last speaker only had 51% support in the House. We don't know. Well, what we do know is the NDP basically holds all the cards. So if Greg Fergus does something stupid, again, the NDP can send him packing. Not just that, if Greg Fergus delivers a ruling the NDP doesn't like, the NDP can move forward a motion to send him packing. So the NDP now sits in a very privileged position that gets to decide the fate of the referee.
I don't think that the fate of the referee should be in having the cards stacked for one particular party.
Oh, I don't agree with you. I'm just saying that is the reality that is playing itself out.
I can't see the other party standing for that.
No,
I think you're going to.
But what options do they have?
And
again, I'm not saying
I saw MPs storm a speaker's chair. It's not a pretty spectacle, but it does happen.
When was that?
Back in the days. Yes.
But if he believed in this position, if he believes in this position and what it represents in Parliament,
who is he? Greg Fergus?
He has to go.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Is there not only one solution? Winning back the trust of the House, it seems to be his game plan, and I don't know how that works.
Well, clearly, as we've seen, because it took Anthony Rota a few days too long to leave, that once people are in the chair, they're hesitant to leave. I think, the best thing that can happen right now is if the Conservatives behave properly when the Deputy Speaker is in the chair, who is a Conservative, and do not, as they have shown for the last month, try to make his life miserable by getting themselves booted out. Then maybe the NDP will be more likely to say to Greg Fergus, you need to go because we can live with the option that's number 2.
Yeah.
That's it.
But that doesn't mean that number 2 is the option. It is an election.
No, it doesn't mean, but I think...
Do you have to have an election?
No, I mean, the other thing we've seen...
Unless nobody wants the job.
2 things. The Bloc has basically floated that they might be willing to support an NDP chair, because they talked about having a woman in the Speaker's chair. So there's like some backroom shenanigans happening. And can I also say, this is very procedurally wonky, but they had this committee. They invited the clerk, the acting clerk, to come in front of them to tell them about, like, if Greg Fergus had asked for your advice, what would you have said? All these things. Basically, the poor clerk was answering questions from his bosses. And then at the end of the charade, they said, hey, congratulations. Your job is now permanent. Like, what a farce this whole place is.
I love this very much. Last word.
You know that ritual when they appoint the new speaker where they drag the person unwillingly to the chair? The next one may not be just a ritual.
We'll be dragged out of the chair is what's going to happen.
Dragged out too. Okay, it was
Well, they used to beat them.
Oh, no.
That's why there was the dragging. I mean, politically, we can... That is what we're saying.
What do you make of anything that we've been talking about? Let us know what you think. Send us a DM on Instagram, CBC The National. Email ask@cbc.ca. You can catch me on Rosemary Barton Live back in Ottawa Sundays at 10 a.m. Eastern. We'll be in your podcast feeds next week. Thanks so much for listening.